Okay, and welcome to another episode number 15 of Chai Study Press's series in Chinese Australian history. And today I'm bringing one I'm always very interested in. It's the observations of a China consul, J. Dundas Crawford, who wrote a fascinating account for the British Empire back in 1877 when he visited Australia. Fascinating because he's one of the few European observers who actually knew something about Chinese culture and was able to observe people in Australia in a relatively objective manner. He made some very interesting observations. This discussion by How Friendly Bots is based on an article I wrote many years ago, in the year 2000 in fact, published in Locality magazine. A magazine is very hard to get a hold of now, so I'll be happy to republish this fairly soon. I'll probably make a collection of a number of these old articles that I'm now putting here on the podcast, and I'll adjust the podcast downloads when that happens. But for now, let's let our bots discuss the observations of J. Dundas Crawford and how his insights help challenge some of the many stereotypes that still persist about Chinese Australian history, particularly in the 19th century. I hope you enjoy.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're taking a deep dive into Chinese immigration to the Australian colonies, specifically in the late 19th century.
Right.
We're not just, scratching the surface here. Our mission is to pull out some surprising facts, some crucial insights from this really unique source, an 1877 report.
Yeah, by a British China consul, J. Dundas Crawford.
Exactly. And his observations, well, they can really broaden our understanding of a period that's often, let's face it, stereotyped.
It's true. I mean, look, many historical accounts of Chinese people in 19th century Australia, they tend to fall into generalizations, sometimes biased narratives. But Crawford's report, now, despite having its own, Victorian era perspective.
It's effects of the time.
Right. It really stands out. His familiarity with Chinese language, culture, and he seems to have genuinely aimed for some neutrality. It gives a depth of observation that's just, well, incredibly rare for back then.
So this deep dive should hopefully eliminate the real diversity, the complex reasons why people came.
Absolutely, and challenge some assumptions that, still hang around today.
Okay, so to really get the value here, let's talk about Crawford himself first and where this report actually came from.
Good idea.
It was prepared on instructions from Her Majesty's Charge d'Affaires at Peking. So, high-level stuff. For the British Foreign Office, 1877.
Right.
Part 1, it gives a sort of general overview, migration across Australia. But Part 2, that zooms in on Cooktown and the Palmer River goldfields.
Which were the key destination then, yeah, for new arrivals.
Exactly.
And the key, as you sort of touched on, the really unique value here is Crawford's language skills.
Right. He knew Chinese.
Well, he was trained in Mandarin, and most migrants back then came from non-Mandarin areas, like the Pearl River Delta, mostly Cantonese speakers and others.
Okay, so maybe not a perfect match.
Not perfect, but his report, it gives really strong evidence he had good Chinese language skills overall. I mean, he translates signs, shop signs, temple signs.
Yeah, interesting.
He criticizes trainees used in some Victorian documents as inelegantly worded. He even recounts a whole conversation between a famous merchant, Kong Meng, and his gardeners.
So he could actually understand and probably speak it to some degree?
It seems very likely, and these skills were probably why they sent him. That makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's important to add, while his direct observations are really sharp, he wasn't always critical about what other people told him.
Okay.
Especially regarding Aboriginal Australians. He seems to have just accepted hearsay there.
Right. So good on what he saw himself, maybe less reliable on secondhand accounts.
That's a fair way to put it.
So given all this potential, this detail, what's really striking is you said it's not been used much by modern researchers.
It's quite surprising, isn't it? Why would such a potentially rich document be, well, overlooked?
Yeah. Any theories?
Well, one idea that's been floated is maybe a sort of postmodern tendency, focusing so much on the observer's biases that you end up not using the observations themselves.
Okay. I could see that happening.
But perhaps a more credible reason is simpler. Maybe just a limited knowledge of the specific Chinese cultural background among many researchers looking at Chinese Australian history.
So without that context.
Exactly. Without that context, it's hard to really grasp the significance of what Crawford was actually pointing out.
Makes sense. Okay, let's get into those observations then. Motivations. Why did people come? Crawford starts by identifying three main causes.
Right. He lists them as overpopulation, internecine feuds, and a universal spirit of gambling.
Gambling. Interesting link to the gold rush itself.
Yeah, but then he adds, resulting in different degrees of slavery, crime, and debt.
Wow, okay. So it's much more than just gold fever.
Definitely. For these men, mostly from the south of China, gold hunting was, yes, maybe excitement, but also escape. A way to potentially return rich, maybe compensate for past problems, debts, even crimes, or just misfortune.
That paints a much broader picture than you usually get from 19th century sources.
Right.
At that
Oh, absolutely. That universal spirit of gambling, okay, that links them to other gold seekers. But mentioning slavery, crime, and debt, that points to specific, really tough conditions back in China.
Conditions that Crawford, with his background, would have understood better than most outsiders.
Precisely. He understood how these factors played into how people migrated and, the grim reality that for many of these men of the South, going back might not even be an option, even if they struck it rich.
So let's talk about the migrants themselves. We often get this monolithic image, right?
Right.
But Crawford digs into the diversity.
He really does. He blows apart that idea that all Chinese migrants were the same. He gives details on where they came from, their districts of origin, and reveals these really deep divisions.
Like what?
Well, he mentions the rivalry of race between Hakka and Punti, meaning the sort of mainstream Cantonese speakers. These were distinct groups, often rivals back home.
Okay.
He talks about feuds between Cantonese and Fukim, who are Fujianese people. He mentions Amoy men, natives of Swato. He's naming specific places and groups.
So real internal complexity.
And even political and sort of sectarian divisions. He mentions 2 great leagues of Yik among the Cantonese. The wealthier folks, Canton citizens proper, apparently look down on their poorer neighbors in the rival league.
Amazing detail.
And get this, he describes a village of pure Tartars near Sandhurst in Victoria, descendants of the Manchu garrison that once controlled Canton.
Wow. Manchu descendants in the Victorian goldfields. That's incredible.
Isn't it? And this level of detail, it really shows how these internal divisions could shape where people settled, who they associated with in Australia.
Does he give examples of that?
He does. He mentions an attempt to set up organizations for repaying debts, sort of like they did in California, but it failed.
Why?
On account of disagreements between the clans Hakka and Punti. So those rivalries directly impacted community organization in Australia. And incidentally, it shows things here didn't always just copy the U.S. experience.
Right, a distinct Australian context. Okay, so diverse origins, internal rivalries. What about their economic situations when they arrived? Was everyone equally poor?
No, Crawford challenges that too. He uses terms like slaves, bondsmen, apprentices and freedmen, gang leaders, and clans.
Slaves. That sounds pretty confronting.
It does, but he clarifies it. He suggests that slaves in the Chinese context back then didn't necessarily mean the same level of coercion that his British readers might assume.
How so?
He actually states that both slaves and bondsmen were often, materially at least, better off than in China. Their main gripe on the Palmer River goldfield wasn't the servitude itself, but their master being careless or improvident given the risks.
Okay, that's a really important nuance. And this leads to something fascinating you mentioned earlier, explaining why Chinese miners often stayed on worked-out goldfields.
Yes, this is a classic observation, right? Chinese miners patiently picking over ground that Europeans had abandoned as exhausted.
And the usual explanation is psychological. They were just more patient or had different techniques.
Exactly. But Crawford gives a game-changing insight. He says this was often because they were bonded laborers and slaves, or working steadily under agreement.
Ah, so they didn't have a choice.
Pretty much. If his earnings are not his own, Crawford writes, the worker stays in his basic clothes, straw shoes, coarse cotton, eating simple food like pickled cabbage and jerked pork till his time is fulfilled.
So contractual obligations, not just personality.
Exactly. This contractual labor explanation, it's a massive contribution. It's a piece that's often missing from standard histories.
So beyond gold, what else were people doing? Crawford's notes touch on other occupations too, right?
They do. He mentions the things we expect, like running stores, market gardening.
Ah, yes, the market gardens.
And he notes how they reduced vegetables from an expensive luxury to being a cheap and universal article of diet. A huge impact.
Definitely. What else?
He also mentions fishing. Chinese residents apparently divided the fisheries with Italians and had fishing stations along parts of the Queensland coast.
Interesting. Fisheries too.
Yeah. But interestingly, he notes what wasn't common compared to the U.S. experience: fewer bootmakers, washermen, domestic servants among the Chinese in Australia. And he makes this observation: no Australian capitalist employs Chinese in any manufacture or in any agricultural industry.
Which tells you something about the economic structure and perhaps the racial barriers at the time.
Precisely. It points towards segregation in the labor market.
Now, that hostility towards Chinese residents, it often centered on this idea of cheap labor, didn't it? Does Crawford help us understand why their labor practices seem different?
He does, and it's more complicated than just they worked for less. It wasn't just cultural differences or, false impressions.
All right.
Crawford details a whole range of employment setups. You had workers in debt who might actually desert their employers because, well, Australian institutions and the lure of higher wages elsewhere were strong.
Right, the freedom here offered different options.
Then you had others who paid off their debts quickly and started demanding their own terms. You had those slaves he mentioned, serving with what he called feudal devotion.
A whole spectrum.
And workers who were bound to their employers as often by ties of kinship as by self-interest or because of family connections back in China. It's this much broader, more nuanced picture that's so crucial for understanding why conflicts arose with non-Chinese workers who likely saw only the surface.
That makes a lot of sense. What about social structures? Did he observe community organizations?
Yes, he shed some light there too. He talks about organizations like the Sheathed Sword Society.
It sounds ominous.
Maybe, but he distinguishes it from other groups because of its preponderating influence in sworn fraternity. He also saw other temples or halls in Ballarat named things like the Priceless Triad, Triad of Purity, Triad of Union.
So these were like the community centers or mutual aid societies.
Sort of. He notes these so-called secret societies, which Europeans were often suspicious of, were mainly focused on public things like burial rites and maybe raising funds for rituals for the dead. The manuscript says revenue, which is a bit unclear.
Right.
But he also observed they were kind of declining into mere tea shops in some places.
Changing functions.
And then there's the really critical role of interpreters.
Ah, yes. More than just translating.
Much more. They were absolutely central figures. They were often responsible for reporting crimes, seeking punishment of lawbreakers, and they often got the blame if a thief managed to get away from the police.
Wow. A lot of responsibility. Where did they learn English?
Various ways. Some were born in Australia, some were self-taught, some had worked for shipping companies or in places like Hong Kong or Singapore. It highlights just how pivotal and probably precarious their position was.
Crawford's report really seems to humanize the migrants too, moving beyond just economic units or problems.
It really does. He observes their humble extravagance, as he puts it, an imperceptible bettering of dress and accessories as people got established.
Little signs of settling in, maybe doing a bit better.
Yeah, but often, he says, attended by increasing expenditure in play, gambling again.
Ah, right. What sort of games?
He mentions dominoes being really popular, and a specific Fujianese game played with a teetotum that's a kind of spinning top.
Okay.
And this game apparently took players symbolically through every official rank of the Mandarinate, all the way up to a governor generalship. A bit of escapism, perhaps.
Maybe. What about other leisure? Opium.
He gives a detailed analysis of opium smoking. He notes it was indulged in so ostentatiously in Australia, perhaps more openly than back home, but alongside that, simpler things. People meeting after work to smoke tobacco and drink tea.
Just normal socializing.
Exactly. And in Cooktown, he mentions the Garden of Gold Valleys, likely a community hall or tea house offered free music every evening.
Sounds quite nice, actually.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we even get this incredibly rare glimpse inside a merchant's private home.
Really? What was it like?
He describes this mat-hidden world: imported porcelain, bronzes, children being petted, family portraits where they're wearing formal Mandarin dress, wives playing the zither, a Chinese stringed instrument.
Wow. That paints such a different picture. It really brings them to life as just people living their lives.
It does. It's those small domestic details. They show cultural continuity, leisure, family life, personal touches, so much more than just the stereotype of the transient single male gold digger. It reminds you these were real communities with the full spectrum of human experience.
Speaking of challenging stereotypes, there are two characteristics often seen as almost universal for overseas Chinese communities, right?
Yes, definitely.
Regularly sending money, home remittances, and this deep concern for the dead. making sure bones were eventually returned to the home village.
Those are very common assumptions, yes.
Does Crawford confirm them?
Actually, no. His observations directly challenge both, at least for the time and places he observed.
Really? What does he say?
He states quite plainly that only a few remit money to China.
Only a few. That's surprising.
And regarding funerals, he says there was little zeal regarding funerals at Cooktown. He even notes that on the early Palmer River goldfield, it required all the efforts of the police to force the Chinese to bury their dead.
Wow. Police forcing burials.
Yeah. And in Melbourne, when he asked why there weren't more funeral organizations, he was told simply, "We are young and death comes warily."
Okay, that's a fascinating insight. It suggests maybe those strong ties back to the home village, the formalized structures, they didn't just appear instantly.
Exactly. It suggests they might have grown gradually as communities became more established, as networks deepened over time. Not an automatic, ingrained behavior from day one for everyone.
And it wasn't just Chinese customs that varied, was it? He also noted differences in how Europeans reacted or how Chinese people adapted in different colonies.
Yes, this is another really interesting point. He draws a stark contrast between Sydney and Melbourne.
How so?
In Sydney, he observed, Chinese people, whether rich or poor, tended to reduce themselves to a common level. They kept a low profile, deliberately, in order to disarm public opposition.
Trying not to stand out because of prejudice.
That's what he implies. It created, in his words, an unhappy air of constraint that made them seem different from their free-mannered countrymen in Victoria.
So a suggestion of different levels of prejudice or different community responses between NSW and Victoria.
It's incredibly suggestive, isn't it? Different patterns of interaction and adaptation in different colonies. That's something that often gets glossed over in broader histories, assuming a uniform experience across Australia.
Definitely food for thought. Okay, let's circle back to migration itself. How do people actually get here? The credit ticket system is the one you usually hear about.
Right, the idea that someone pays your fare and you're indebted, often having to work for them to pay it off.
Did Crawford's observations fit that neat model?
His notes suggest it's maybe too neat, or that the definition needs to be broader. It seems the credit ticket system was just one method among many.
Okay. What else did he describe?
He talks about country villagers who could form themselves into cooperative bands and emigrate in a clan. Pooling resources, perhaps?
Right, group migration.
Or individuals could enter into unwritten bonds with a labor agent. He mentions voluntary servitude, which sounds odd, but apparently it could involve a pension being paid to the person's parents back home.
So a family support element.
Possibly. And he notes participation in wider Southeast Asian networks, workmen who might make a living by serving successive contracts of 3 or 4 years duration in places like Saigon or Singapore before maybe coming to Australia.
So Australia was just one node in a larger migration network.
It seems so for some. And specifically for Queensland, he mentions immigration agents working for companies in both Australia and China. They organize transport on different classes of steamers.
Including chartered ships.
Yes, including chartered vessels carrying maybe 200 picked men, organized into gangs that explicitly included slaves alongside other workers.
It's a much more complex, varied picture of how people financed and organized their journeys.
Absolutely. Much more varied than just the standard credit ticket story implies.
Finally, Crawford even touches on a couple of notorious myths associated with the anti-Chinese sentiment, doesn't he? Lambing Flat and cannibalism?
Yes. Lambing Flat refers to the violent anti-Chinese riots there in New South Wales. And there was this persistent, lurid myth about Aboriginal Australians being cannibals with a particular preference for Chinese people.
Horrific. What did Crawford observe about these stories?
He noticed that both stories were sometimes told by Europeans specifically to intimidate the Chinese.
To bluff them, as he put it.
Exactly, using dark allusions to the tragedy of Lambing Flat. And the cannibalism myth, interestingly, was apparently also used by Chinese storytellers themselves, maybe around the campfire, to scare the newcomers.
So myths being used and perpetuated by different groups for different reasons.
It shows how these narratives circulated and took on a life of their own.
And Crawford was writing all this down at a really critical moment, wasn't he?
Absolutely pivotal. Chinese migration, specifically for gold, had basically peaked. And it was just before the colonies started bringing in major anti-Chinese immigration laws.
Laws that would ultimately make his own prediction that Australia might see a nucleus of Asiatic colonization completely impossible.
Exactly. History took a very different turn shortly after he wrote this.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive into Crawford's 1877 report, It really has peeled back layers of assumption, of stereotype, hasn't it?
It really has.
It reveals a much richer, far more diverse, definitely more complex picture of Chinese people in 19th century Australia than we often get. It's just such a powerful reminder that history is never, ever as simple as we might think initially, and that these hidden gems, these unique sources, can fundamentally shift how we see things.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? I mean, if just one unique source, like Crawford's report, written with a particular perspective but also real insight, can challenge so many widely held beliefs about just one group, 19th century Chinese migrants in Australia.
Yeah.
It raises the question, what other historical figures, maybe other overlooked documents, might be out there holding similar kinds of hidden insights? Insights that could fundamentally change how we understand other marginalized communities and their experiences throughout history.
That is a really important question to ponder. What else are we missing? Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and stay curious.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that discussion by our friendly bots. I think they did a quite good job of introducing what J. Dundas Crawford had to say. As I say, I do have access to the original report. If you'd like to read that, there you have to go onto the site of Chinese Australian History in 88 Objects. Easy to search for. I'll put the link in the on the notes. Also, as usual, this is brought to you by Child Study Press, which you can email at childstudypress@gmail.com. If you wish to have any feedback or make any suggestions as to which any other podcasts you'd like me to present. So I'm working through most of my own material at the moment, but I'm quite happy to discuss other people's material or any other interesting information that people might have related to Chinese Australian history, or on occasion I do something that's unrelated to Chinese Australian history as well. Again, thank you very much for your listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.